Of the Piedmont Triad, and I am so happy to see all of you here. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the League of Women Voters, which actually is both women and men, and we are a nonpartisan political organization, which means that we do not endorse any candidates or political parties, but we do study issues and take stands on issues. And the way that we study issues is by forming small groups that we call round tables. And this tonight is brought to you by the Health Roundtable. Now every month we have a program at Holy Trinity over the lunch hour at noon. And different roundtables put on the different programs. They are free, open to the public. We hope that you will come. We do appreciate advanced registration so that we know how many chairs to put out. And if you want lunch there, there is a charge. But the program itself is free. April 16th will be the Environment Roundtable, so hope to see some of you there. Tonight's presentation is about healthcare reform, and healthcare is something that's important to all of us. It's important to all of us who are voters. And so our hope in bringing Dr. Oberlander is that he can help us understand both the history of healthcare reform and also what our choices are now, so that we as individuals can make the kinds of choices that fit with our values, so that when we go to the polls or we communicate with our representatives, that we will have a clear idea of what it is we think. There are co-sponsors for tonight's event, and we thank them. The Cone Health Foundation, we're very grateful to them, and also Healthcare for All NC is a sponsor, so thank you to them. And if you didn't pick up information about either the League or Healthcare for All NC in the lobby, please feel free to do so afterwards. There is information out there about both of them. And I also want to point out to you this beautiful facility that we are in. This is Union Square campus, and it is a joint effort between A&T, GTCC, and UNCG nursing schools. And so I thank them for letting us be here. And down at the end of the hall, there is a wall that talks about the history of nursing. Some of you might be interested in looking at that. The League is committed to bringing educational programs to our community. And we do not charge for events, but we really like donations. So if you appreciate the program tonight, there are 3 ways in your program to make a donation. and we'd be glad to receive it. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Timothy Lane. He is a member of our roundtable. He's funny, he's smart, he's wise, he provides us with lots of good information, and he's going to introduce Dr. Oberman for us.
Thank you, Ann. Maybe a little funny tonight. It's a pretty serious topic. We've got a wonderful speaker. I've known Jonathan for 20 years when he came to Cone Health to give grand rounds when I was younger then and he was a young boy. He spoke with such powerful way and made you want to listen to someone talking about healthcare policy. There are only 2 or 3 other people in the world who can do that, and he is one of them. So we're very fortunate. He's professor and chair of social medicine in the School of Medicine at Chapel Hill and a professor in the School of Public Health, also UNCG Chapel Hill. He's a Tar Heel fan and a Red Sox fan, so I love him already. He received his BA in political science at UNC and then his doctorate in political science from Yale. And he's had a lot of stops along the way, learning from the best about healthcare policy. And he's written about the history of the United States in public support of healthcare and private support and our patchwork system. His book is The History of Medicare in the United States. It's political history. And he writes regularly for the Social Medicine Reader on a recurring basis. But to a retired physician like myself, I've been reading him every few months in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is the most powerful and prestigious journal. And he has been commenting on our attempts at reform over the last decade, and particularly the Affordable Care Act, or so-called Obamacare. And he's done a marvelous job in reviewing that. I'll give you some of the titles that he has used in these, about bi-monthly reports that he writes. The Art of Repeal, Affordable Care Act in Purgatory, I guess neither heaven nor hell. The Quest for the Holy Grail. So you can see his influence have ranged from Jonathan Smith to the Talmud to the Bible. And he's able to make us relate to these issues of healthcare as part of our culture and the way we think about the world and ourselves. A reviewer of his most recent book, an edition of his book, said the following: his writings on healthcare policy are marked by gusto, concision, and clarity. And I would add a little bit of whimsy. Jonathan, a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks so much for the introduction and to the league for having me down I-40. And I had a beautiful drive, I'm happy to say, down here, and thanks to Ann and Tim and Robin for all the hospitality, and it's really, really great to be here. I did want to clarify one thing, Tim, which is that that article on the Holy Grail, I think, was actually inspired by Monty Python. We want to be accurate about my influence in some way. And I do want to start off by apologizing because you're probably going to see a lot of people like me speak, and I almost hesitate to say this because it really is our collective national nightmare, but if I'm right, I think we have 20 months until the 2020 elections, so you've got a long way to go, and a lot of speakers and a lot of issues to consider, so I'll see if I can knock off one day for you. Since it was a beautiful day in Chapel Hill, and a beautiful day in Greensboro, I thought I'd start out with a fable. And like all fables, this begins once upon a time. So once upon a time, there was a country in the 20th century that wanted to reform its healthcare system. And many of its presidents tried to overhaul our healthcare arrangements, and you see some of them pictured on the screen, and many of them failed. And the 20th century in the United States in healthcare policy, if you had to summarize it in one word, you would say failure. And we failed, and then we failed some more, and then we just, kept failing. But along came another president, and this was a 21st century president, and he had sort of different skill set, so he harnessed his Keanu Reeves Matrix-like powers, and the United States actually succeeded and passed the Affordable Care Act in 2010. And a lot of people thought that was the end of the story, that we didn't have a healthcare system like that in Canada or Great Britain or France or Japan or any of those countries, but we had one that was on the road to looking like those nations. But it turned out there was another chapter in the fable, another chapter of the story to be written, and we had another election in 2016, and a different president came in with a very different idea of what we should do for healthcare reform. And so that is a century of healthcare reform history in the United States in 3 slides. Thank you very much. And I guess I should say something else. So what I want to do this evening is talk a bit about the history and how we got here, how we got to the place we are. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about the Affordable Care Act and what we know about its successes and what we know about its shortcomings, and then what might be in our hazy future, and we should have plenty of time for questions afterwards. So let me start a century ago, and I wanted to show you this cartoon, which dates all the way back to 1919, and this is from the time period when the United States was first debating national health insurance, and the metaphor of insurance as an umbrella was popular back then, and that was the first time that American reformers tried to enact, and they tried to do it on a state level, plan for national health insurance, the very first time. And of course it didn't succeed. If it did succeed, this presentation would be a lot shorter. But it didn't. And Franklin Roosevelt, during his administration, thought about healthcare reform, and there was a lot of reason to believe that President Roosevelt would have done health reform. It was the time of the New Deal. It was a time of really transforming the role of American national government. It was a time when we enacted Social Security, and they thought about adding health insurance to the Social Security Act, but they were worried about its political controversy, and so they omitted it. And it really fell to FDR's successor, Harry Truman, who was the first American president to formally endorse a plan for national health insurance, today what we would call single payer. And Truman had a plan, and you can see, by the way, if you look carefully up there, they used North Carolina to demonstrate how this would work. And I think this is probably slightly less complicated than a graph of the Affordable Care Act, but I'll show that to you later. So Truman tried to enact national health insurance, and that didn't work either. He ran into the opposition of physicians through the American Medical Association. This was during the Cold War, and he ran into the stigma of socialized medicine. And he ran into the fact that there was not a majority of liberal Democrats in Congress, and so he couldn't enact national health insurance. And reformers went in a different direction in the 1950s. They were, I'm going to put this diplomatically, but by the 1950s, health reformers were losers. They had been losing for over 3 decades at that point, and they decided they needed a new strategy. National health insurance for everybody wasn't working, and so they had a fallback option, and that fallback option is Medicare. And it's important to understand, we take for granted as natural that we have a separate insurance program for older Americans and for Americans with permanent disabilities. There's nothing natural about it internationally. We're the only country in the world that separates people by age into a different health insurance program. And the reason we do it is when they couldn't enact national health insurance in the Truman years, they decided they had to do something more incremental, something more popular, something that could circumvent all those obstacles that were in their way, from the AMA to the stigma of socialized medicine to deadlock in Congress. And so they chose to cover older Americans, and they chose to build on the Social Security program. And that was the genesis of Medicare. It was first proposed in the early 1950s. And while Medicare today is an accepted part of American politics, of public policy, of the healthcare system, let us not forget it was very controversial when it was proposed. The original Medicare proposal was 60 days of hospital insurance, and that's it. No other benefit. No physician services, nothing. Even that was controversial. And it took almost 15 years to pass Medicare from the time it was proposed. The folks that you see, by the way, pictured up there in the left-hand corner, Robert Ball and Wilbur Cohen and Arthur Altmaier, they were officials in the Social Security Agency who came up with the idea of using the Social Security model for Medicare and narrowing Truman's National Health Insurance Program to a program for elderly beneficiaries of Social Security. Now, they never thought that that was going to be the final part of the story. Medicare for All is a slogan we hear a lot today, and I'm going to talk about it a little later. But Medicare for All is actually an idea that dates back all the way to the 1960s, because their vision at the beginning was that Medicare would cover older Americans first, and then it would expand. And they thought it was going to expand to cover children. So you can imagine how different our healthcare system would look today if Medicare had covered people over age 65 and then people under age 18. And they thought that once it did that, it was a matter of time before you covered the middle, that it expanded from both directions. They were New Deal Democrats. The world they knew was a political world dominated by liberalism, by Democratic presidents. They could not and did not imagine the transformation in American politics in the 1970s and 1980s in a very different direction. Our concerns, economic concerns, erosion of faith in the government from Vietnam and Watergate and stagflation, and the rise of conservatism. So much so that arguably Jimmy Carter, who's a Democrat elected president in 1976, you could argue, and I would, that he was more conservative on health care than his Republican predecessor, Richard Nixon, was in the early 1970s. And that's because American politics in the mid-1970s moved in a very different direction. Medicare didn't take any of those steps. In 1972, Medicare expanded to cover end-stage renal disease. So we have, essentially in the United States, we have universal health insurance for an organ, which is, it's really difficult to understand. There's a group of German students in public health who come to UNC Chapel Hill every couple of years, and they bring me in and they give me 45 minutes to explain American healthcare to this German group of students. And so I walked into the room, and the first thing I said to them is, I said, I'm happy to be here, and I want you to know that your healthcare system is boring. I find it's best to establish diplomatic rapport early on in a conversation. And so they weren't sure they heard me right, so they had to translate it. And when they had it translated, they understood. And I said, no, you heard me right. German health insurance is boring. Germany has the oldest health insurance system in the world, dating back to the 19th century. And I said, the thing about Germany is you cover everybody. Nobody goes without health insurance in Germany. There's nothing interesting about that in Europe. Everybody does that in Europe. If you want interesting, we have you beat. We have a health insurance system based on organs. So they thought they misunderstood me, so they got to translate again, and then I explained it to them. No, we have universal health insurance for the kidney. It does not matter your age. It does not matter your income. If you have end-stage renal disease, Medicare will cover you. And I've been in medical school for 21 years. I'm a political scientist, so I don't know a lot of medicine, but I understand that kidneys are important. I'm pretty sure the heart is important. I'm pretty sure lungs are important. The brain is important. We just have universal health insurance for the kidney. So Medicare expanded in 1972, and also to cover Americans with permanent disabilities, and that's a group we don't talk enough about. They're an important part of the Medicare population. Under age 65, and Medicare plays a very important role for them. But Medicare didn't take any steps beyond that. That plan that I described, what was called Kiddie Care, to expand Medicare for children, they were pursuing that late in the 1960s, and it ended up being postponed partly because of budget concerns arising out of spending from the Vietnam War. American politics goes in a different direction. Medicare does not expand. Now, Medicare does not become the platform for expanded health insurance coverage. Instead, its twin, Medicaid, does. And I say twin because Medicaid was enacted as part of the same legislation as Medicare, also in 1965. It received almost no attention at the time. President Johnson, when he signed Medicare legislation, and you can see him in the presence of Harry and Bess Truman, making that direct link back to the Truman proposals for national health insurance, when he announced the Medicare bill had passed, he did not mention Medicaid by name. It didn't even warrant a sentence. People thought Medicare would grow. Medicaid was seen as an afterthought, a poor person's program. But when Medicare didn't grow, the focus shifted to Medicaid. And really, Medicaid since 1965, and especially since the 1980s, that has been the expansionary program. And Medicaid picked up over time pregnant women and children, and the federal government raised the eligibility thresholds during the 1980s and during the 1990s. And then in the late 1990s, we enacted the Children's Health Insurance Program that was, again, built on the Medicaid model. And what I think is important to understand about the history of American health policy from 1965 to 2010 is it was built on one overriding principle, what I like to call demographic incrementalism, that we would cover groups, group by group, and we would cover what the late great health economist Uwe Reinhardt called the OCs, the objects of compassion. And we would cover those groups through federal action, through joint federal and state action. We weren't universal, but we were going to cover groups, and that's what we did. We have had a health insurance system built on demography in this country. And the result of that, and the result of everything that we have built, is that around the time the Affordable Care Act was enacted and starting to be implemented, this is what the U.S. health insurance system looks like. Now, I want to backtrack for a second, because I called it a system, and it's really not. The word system connotes reason, rationale, purpose, organization. We don't have any of that in how we deliver healthcare in this country. I often say to my medical students at Carolina and my public health students that I could give them an assignment and say, you have 2 hours to devise the most inefficient, most unequal, most unjust, most expensive, most wasteful method for delivering health insurance. And as smart as they are, and as talented as they are, they can't outdo what we already have here. So this is not a system, but it is what we have developed over that history. And the fact is that when the Obama administration and Congress looked at reforming healthcare in 2009 and 2010, they weren't starting, as no presidential administration has, with a blank slate. They were starting with arrangements where tens of millions of Americans had, like me, employer-sponsored insurance. And they were starting with an arrangement where Medicare and Medicaid were already there. And that, over the years, has created a great conundrum for reformers, because nobody would ever design anything like this on purpose. Nobody ever would. And if they did design something like this on purpose, there are deeper problems than just healthcare. But it's what we have, and once you have it, people get used to it. They get acclimated to it, and it's hard to move away from it. And so the great conundrum of reformers has been, if you ask Americans, what do you think of our healthcare system? A lot of Americans say it's lousy. They say it's not very good. But if you ask them, what do you think of your own insurance? What do you think of your own medical care? They say they like it. And so how do you thread the needle? How do you move towards universal health insurance? How do you reform these arrangements when they're already so entrenched and when we have this fragmented patchwork built in? They had a theory to pass the Affordable Care Act, and their theory went something like this. And I don't know how many of you have read the Affordable Care Act. Let me ask. This is Greensboro, a very cosmopolitan city. How many of you have actually read the Affordable Care Act? How many of you have read at least 2 pages? Okay, I mean, I don't blame you. I prefer to read mystery novels in my spare time. I took the Affordable Care Act to the beach. It didn't last that long. It's long. So I've summarized a couple thousand pages in 4 bullet points. But Their political theory of reform was this, that the only way to pass healthcare reform was not to disturb what we already had. Not because what we had was great, they knew it wasn't, but because politically they didn't want to alienate people who already had insurance. They didn't want to alienate Medicare enrollees, didn't want to alienate people with good employer coverage. So instead of trying to start over, they decided, let's just take that patchwork non-system and let's patch on top of it. One of the great misconceptions of American health policy is that the Affordable Care Act represents a new health insurance system. It absolutely does not. It represents reform, for sure, ambitious change, yes, but it's not a new insurance system. They took the existing insurance system in the United States and they built on top of it. And their view was that was the only way it was going to pass. Now, that's a justifiable view because they did pass the bill, just barely, just by a vote, but they did pass it. But the fact that they built on what we already had has some consequences. And I think you can understand a lot of the problems the Affordable Care Act has had in its operation in the last decade as a consequence of the fact that it was superimposed on that fragmented mess that we already had. All right, so let me say a few things about the Affordable Care Act and how it has performed, both successes and failures. And one of the successes I wanted to mention, and we were talking earlier this evening at dinner about this, it's often overlooked. The Affordable Care Act transformed the practice of health insurance in this country. Before the Affordable Care Act, if you were buying health insurance on your own in virtually any state in this country, insurers could discriminate against you. They could discriminate against you on the basis of a pre-existing condition. And when I would give talks across the state, whether I was up in Asheville or down in Goldsboro or in Manio, no matter where I would be, somebody would come up to me after the talk or say during the talk, and they would say the following. They would say, Professor, I have cancer. My brother or sister or girlfriend, boyfriend, wife has cancer or something else. They can't get insurance. And if they were buying on the individual market, that was true because insurers could discriminate against them and they could deny them coverage and they could deny coverage for that pre-existing condition and they could charge them very high premiums that made it unaffordable. And one of the successes of the Affordable Care Act is it outlawed insurer discrimination on the basis of pre-existing conditions. Insurers can't turn away people anymore on the basis of health status. They can't charge them higher premiums. They can't discriminate on the basis of gender and charge women higher premiums as they used to. So the Affordable Care Act has made a lot of changes to the insurance market that we tend to take for granted. But they are absolutely transformative and they are crucial to giving people access to medical care. Now my students, most of whom are very young, are partial to the second to the last reform by Kerry, which under the Affordable Care Act, young adults up to age 26 can stay on their parents' health plans, which is important and has been an important source of coverage. So I always tell my students to do the following. Call their parents on the phone and say they need a year off from medical school, that they need to find themselves. And I actually, at one point, I wasn't sure what I was doing in graduate school, and I said to my dad, I don't know what I'm doing. I think I need some time to figure out what I'm doing. And my dad didn't say anything. He got up and left the room. And 2 minutes later, he came back with a map, and he said, find yourself. Good advice. Anyway, so I tell my students, call your parents on the phone, you need a year off, and then ask them if you can get on their health insurance plan. And if they tell you no, something is up, because legally they can put you on their plan, and so it probably means they just don't love you. And you should probably discover that earlier in life. So anyway, so all of this has become part of the status quo, and that's important for what I'm going to say later about the policies of health reform today. Of course, the central purpose of the Affordable Care Act was to reduce the uninsured population in this country And this is showing you what the uninsured population was. And you can see about 18% of the non-elderly population was uninsured. Before the Affordable Care Act, close to 49 million. And you can see it went down to about 28 million. So there have been substantial gains in Americans picking up insurance coverage. Some of those gains come through the Affordable Care Act's insurance marketplaces, which are also called exchanges. This is where you go if you're uninsured and say you're working and you don't have insurance through your employer. You can go on these marketplaces, and each state has one. If the state doesn't run it itself, the federal government runs it, and in most states the federal government runs it. So you go to healthcare.gov, and it's a little bit like Expedia. You pick from different kinds of insurance plans, and they come in different combinations at different price points. And based on your income, you get a subsidy. And you can see last year, we had, about a year ago, about 10.5 million people had selected plans, and they had paid for those plans. So they had enrolled in them and paid their premiums. And the vast majority of them were getting subsidies. Almost 90% of them were getting subsidies to help them afford the premium costs. Because without those subsidies, health insurance is prohibitively expensive. And on average, they were getting about $500 a month. So a pretty substantial subsidy. And about half of them were getting a second kind of subsidy, because if we subsidize people to afford to buy health insurance, the question is, can they afford to use it? Can they afford the deductibles, the co-payments, the co-insurance, all those things? And so about half of those who are part of this Affordable Care Act marketplace also get subsidies to help them afford those costs. Now, the Affordable Care Act has had a lot of successes. A lot of people have benefited from it. It has driven down the uninsured rate, but it's got a lot of problems. And I think you have to be frank about its problems. And I want to demonstrate one of its problems right here. So I'm showing you the premiums you would see if you're buying health insurance through these Affordable Care Act marketplaces, if you're uninsured. I'm showing you the premiums that you would see if you were age 30. That's an age group we want to buy health insurance because they're young and they're healthy and they balance out the risk pool. So I'm showing you at different incomes what their monthly premium would be for a silver plan. Now, the plans on the marketplace are like the Olympics. They come in different medals, but it's better than the Olympics because there are 4. There's a platinum. Imagine, you know that terrible shot they show on TV of the person who comes in 4th and he or she just loses by a 1/10 of a second? If you had 4 medals, they join the winner's circle. So the platinum plan, like your platinum credit card, covers the most. Gold second. I'm showing you silver. Most people choose silver plans because the subsidies are geared and based on silver plans. So somebody who, in Chapel Hill, who made $20,000, they can get a health insurance plan for about $66 a month through the Affordable Care Act. That's pretty good. That's a pretty good rate for health insurance. But look what happens as we go up the income scale. If we take somebody who makes $40,000, and I'm going to say they're a self-employed graphic designer because half of the people I meet under age 40 are self-employed graphic designers. So I can't figure it out. So they would face a premium of $300 a month. $300 a month. And a deductible of $4,000. And their out-of-pocket maximum, including their co-pays and co-insurance, is over $7,000. So here's the point. The Affordable Care Act, if you're buying coverage through the marketplace, is a pretty good deal if you're very low income. But if you are not very low income, it's not such a good deal. And there are millions of middle-class Americans for whom health care is still not affordable. And that's because the subsidies in the Affordable Care Act are not comprehensive enough for middle-class Americans. And you can see it right here, and it's been a problem with the law from the beginning, and it's still a problem. It gets worse as you age, and I'm showing you now the same graph, but for age 60. And I want to call your attention to the final number here. Imagine if you're age 60, You're self-employed, you make $50,000, that's a good income, but you're not rich. The premium that you would face is over $1,100 a month. So when you hear people say the Affordable Care Act is unaffordable, it's absolutely the case that for many Americans, health insurance is still unaffordable under the Affordable Care Act. That's absolutely true, and it has to do with the subsidies in the law and their limits. Now, there's been another problem in these marketplaces, these online insurance pools, and that has been they've proven to be more volatile than people wanted. If you look the first couple of years, those premium increases weren't bad. Actually, the first year, a lot less expensive than people predicted. But look at what happened in 2017 and 2018. Now, these are national numbers. So in some states, including the one we're in, the average increase for these plans was actually much higher than that. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But the major one is this. Private insurers were losing money on these marketplaces. The population that was enrolling was a bit sicker, costlier than they anticipated. And they didn't have their premium set high enough to meet those costs. And so they lost money. And a lot of private insurers said, we're not going to participate anymore. And so many Americans lost choice of plans who were in these Affordable Care Act marketplaces. The ones who stayed in increased their rates, and they increased their rates by a lot. And so that volatility has been a problem. It is important to understand, though, that if you were buying insurance through the Affordable Care Act on these marketplaces, and if you qualify for a subsidy, if you make about $48,000 or less as an individual, the fact that the premium goes up doesn't really affect you, because the way the law is written, the subsidy goes up to match the cost. And so you can see that even though the overall cost of the premium per month went way up between 2014 and 2018, what consumers paid who were subsidized didn't change at all. But what that chart isn't showing you is there are still a couple million Americans inside the health insurance marketplaces who aren't subsidized at all. So they bear absolutely the full weight of those premium increases. And outside of the marketplace, there are still Americans buying coverage directly from insurance brokers and directly from insurers, and they don't qualify for subsidies, and they've been hit. So a lot of Americans, even though those with subsidies are protected, a lot of Americans buying individual insurance have experienced very high premium increases. I want to switch now to Medicaid, and when the Affordable Care Act was enacted, the plan was that Medicaid was going to be expanded to all Americans who did not have health insurance and who made less than about $15,000 a year in every state across the country, regardless of demography. We were going to move away from demographic eligibility, and we were going to pick up a lot of Americans, including, in particular, childless adults, single men without dependents in particular, who could not legally qualify for Medicaid under the old rules, couldn't qualify. We were going to cover them, and we were going to go to an income-based standard across the country. And the problem that arose was when the Supreme Court heard a case about the Affordable Care Act in 2012, it upheld the individual mandate, the requirement to buy insurance, which I'll talk about later as constitutional, but it overturned the Medicaid expansion, and it said it was unduly coercive of the states. And it effectively made it a state option. And a lot of states, including North Carolina, have opted not to expand Medicaid. And some of the states that have not opted to expand Medicaid, North Carolina and Georgia, Texas, Florida, those are big population states where a lot of the uninsured live. And it's created a big hole in health insurance, because if you're in North Carolina, if you're in Greensboro, and you make $30,000 and you don't have health insurance, you can go on healthcare.gov and you can qualify for a subsidy and buy a plan through the marketplace. But if you live in Greensboro and you make $10,000 a year and you're very low income, you can't qualify for Medicaid if you weren't already eligible in North Carolina under the old rules, because we have not expanded, like those other 13 states have not expanded. and you're not allowed to go in the marketplace and qualify for any subsidy either. So in other words, some of the lowest income North Carolinians have been left out. And across the country, there are about 2 million Americans who make under the federal poverty level, under $12,000 a year. They don't qualify for anything under the Affordable Care Act because their state did not expand Medicaid. Instead of creating one new national standard, we have actually created two Americas in Medicaid, and you can see it here on the left side of this chart is the uninsured rate for states that have expanded Medicaid. On the right side is states that have not expanded Medicaid. And that tells you two things. One, Medicaid is centrally important to health insurance access, and two, we really do have two Americas right now in healthcare reform. And one set of states that's gone one way, and one set of states that has gone another. Having said that, Medicaid has expanded and expanded substantially nationally, and the biggest gains in the Affordable Care Act are not through the marketplaces. They get all the media. The biggest gains in health insurance coverage in the United States in the last decade are right here. They're through the Medicaid program. And that is where most uninsured Americans have gained coverage. All right, so let me turn to a different issue now and talk a little bit about the battle over, well, repeal and replace. Let me give you a second just to take this cartoon. It's incredible, you know, good cartoonists can say more in one photo than people like me can say in an hour. So I thought about just, instead of talking, I thought about just showing cartoons, music in the background, and I think it might go better. Anyway, when Donald Trump was elected president, there was good reason for Republicans to believe that they can make good on their pledge to repeal the Affordable Care Act. They had been promising to repeal it ever since it was enacted, had a Republican in the White House in January 2017, a Republican majority House, a Republican majority Senate. And when they set out to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, their version of replace looked in some ways very different from the Affordable Care Act. And in a way that's not surprising because the Affordable Care Act reflects Democratic philosophy, Democratic Party philosophy about health care. And Democrats thought you needed more insurance regulation and a lot more subsidies and more redistribution and taxes. And they thought you had to mandate people to get coverage and all those things. And Republicans have a different set of values, a different set of governing philosophy, and they, in healthcare reform debates, emphasize the benefits of deregulation and moving decisions to the states and out of Washington, and the economic benefits of lower taxes. And so the Republican plan in 2017, the American Health Care Act, which is the Republican plan that passed the House of Representatives, was in many ways the opposite of the Affordable Care Act because it reflected Republican priorities. The Republican effort to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act came up short, and there's a long story about why it came up short, and you'll remember Senator McCain famously going to the floor of the Senate and going like this. But the one point I want to make about the repeal effort in 2017 is Republicans had a very narrow majority in the Senate. Remember, their legislation passed in the House. If instead of having 52 Republicans in the Senate, they had 54 or 55 or 56, I think repeal and replace would have passed in 2017. And it was very difficult for the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to make that narrow majority work. When repeal and replace came up short, when it failed in 2017, the question was, what were Republicans going to do next? Were they going to leave healthcare alone? Were they going to work with Democrats? What were they going to do? And what has happened over the past year, the past 18 months, is that the Trump administration and Republicans in Congress have settled on a different strategy. They haven't brought back full-bore repeal and replace, and of course, that's not possible anymore after the 2018 elections. Instead, what has happened is the Trump administration has tried to weaken the Affordable Care Act through administrative actions. Just like President Obama tried to strengthen it. He used his executive authority. President Trump is using his executive authority, just with a different goal in mind. And you can see some of what has happened in the past year and a half on healthcare reform. A lot of people, when this started to happen, a lot of people said, well, this is repeal by another name. Because they failed to get repeal in place through Congress, they're trying to undermine the law administratively. And a lot of people thought that this would really unravel the Affordable Care Act, that this really was the beginning of the end of the Affordable Care Act, and particularly the insurance marketplaces would come apart. It turns out that has not happened. The law is surprisingly, in some ways, at least to date, resilient. And this slide shows you a little bit about that. So what this slide is showing you, two things I want to call attention to. This is enrollment in the Affordable Care Act marketplaces over time. And you can see 2015 and 2016, there is an increase. And then you can see it flattened out and then decreased a bit. So it's true that enrollment has declined a bit under the Trump administration, but not by very much. And by the way, that number for 2019 just came out yesterday. It was just announced yesterday by the federal government. Enrollment went down about 300,000 people this year. So yes, enrollment in the marketplaces has stopped growing. Yes, it is going down, and yet they remain very stable. And the question is, why? Why are they stable? And the answer is probably that the most important thing that the Affordable Care Act has going for it are all those subsidies to buy insurance that I mentioned earlier. And as long as you have those subsidies, a lot of people are going to come and buy coverage because there's a great demand for health insurance. Having said that, there are changes, and you can see them here. So note that the dark green, there, those are states where the federal government is running the enrollment process. The light green are states where states are running the process. And you can see those are states like California and New York. So those are states that are still advertising. Those are states that are still trying to get people enrolled. Their enrollment hasn't gone down at all. Where the enrollment is coming down is in states like North Carolina, where the federal government is in charge. And it's probably coming down in those states because the federal government's not spending the money on enrollment, not spending the money on advertising, and so forth. So there is something going on there that you can see. However, there is another bit of news about the insurance marketplaces that is a surprise. I showed you the slide before about how great the premium increases were in 2017 and 2018. And the marketplaces were volatile. And a lot of people said, this is going to be the end of the marketplaces, the insurers are going to pull out. Well, some insurers did, but a lot stayed. And it turns out that insurers are now making money in the Affordable Care Act marketplaces. And actually, this year, premiums declined. Now, I'm going to say that again because it's not a sentence I get to say in American health policy very often. But for people buying insurance plans through the Affordable Care Act, their premiums on average actually went down this year. And so the marketplaces, in some ways, have stabilized, and the insurers are doing better. Enrollment is steady. There's still a lot of uncertainty, though. And one of the reasons there's uncertainty is this is the first year where the repeal has taken effect, where people are no longer required to buy health insurance or pay a penalty. And the question is, are a lot of younger, healthier Americans going to increasingly sit out of this market because they no longer have to pay a penalty? There's an argument over how big an effect that is. We're going to find out in the next couple of years. There's something else that's going on, and that is beyond the marketplace. Remember, I mentioned before that millions of Americans still on their own buy coverage outside the marketplace without subsidies. So this is 2017 to 2018, and you can see the people who are subsidized on the ACA marketplace, actually that coverage went up in those 2 years. And those who were not subsidized went down. Look at the loss of people off the exchange. Over 2 million people stopped buying coverage. Now, if your goal is to get towards universal health insurance and have more people covered, and you're trying to do it through the individual marketplace, that's a bad number. The individual market's going in the wrong direction. That probably is a consequence of those rising premiums in those years. And it tells you, though, that something is wrong here. This is not how the picture was supposed to look in 2019 when they were thinking about this a decade ago. So there is still a problem in that individual health insurance market in the United States. I wanted to mention one last thing about repeal and replace, and that is it's had a very strange political effect. You know, the Affordable Care Act has never been all that popular. It's not Medicare. It's not Social Security. And you can see in 2010, from the time it was passed, for the next 7 years, the country was divided, and most years, more people had an unfavorable view of the Affordable Care Act than a favorable view. Look what happened all of a sudden, started in 2017, the Affordable Care Act became popular. Now that's a puzzle, because nothing changed about the law. It didn't get any better. There wasn't anything new about it. So why did it become popular? And I have a theory about this, and here's my theory. Sometimes you have your favorite television show, and it's known as a critic's favorite, which is a euphemism for nobody's watching it but you and your friends. So my favorite show that's an example of this is Arrested Development, the old version of Arrested Development, critic's favorite. And sometimes when they announce that these shows are canceled, people get a morbid curiosity, and more people start watching. So I think what happened is a lot of Americans said, now wait a minute, Obamacare, the miniseries, we are not done with that. We want more episodes. Do not take it off our television. So the swing in popularity of the Affordable Care Act is because of repeal and replace. Once the law was threatened, once there was a chance of repeal, more people started to say, wait a minute, we were confused about it, but now we get it. We understand what we're going to lose. And, you know, if President Obama had known this, then while he was president, he could have tried to repeal his own law. And that maybe would have made it more popular than it was at the time. But the politics of the Affordable Care Act in 2019 are different than they were in 2016. Because the law is more popular, it has changed it. And you saw it in the last election, in the midterm congressional election in 2018, where pre-existing conditions were a major issue in the congressional election, and they're probably going to be a major issue in 2020, and that's because pre-existing conditions don't discriminate by political affiliation. They affect everybody, and they affect a large portion of Americans who, if the pre-existing condition protections in the Affordable Care Act were rolled back, or if they were eroded, people would be at risk. And so the politics of healthcare reform today have been transformed, and for many years, the Affordable Care Act debate was about the parts of the law that were the least popular, like the individual mandate penalty. Now, increasingly, the debate is also about parts of the law that are very popular, like the pre-existing condition protections, and that has changed its politics. I want to mention one last thing in terms of pre-existing conditions. You may have heard this in the news today, but another name for the Affordable Care Act is the Lawyer Full Employment Act of 2010, because there's just one lawsuit after another, and they are not done. And some of you may know that a federal judge a few months ago ruled that the entire Affordable Care Act is illegal, and that the entire law should be struck down. That is in reaction to a suit brought by attorneys general from 20 Republican states, led, as you see here, by Texas. And their argument is because the Affordable Care Act was upheld as constitutional in 2012 on the basis of the individual mandate penalty being equivalent to a tax. That's what Chief Justice Roberts said. That's what he cited, because it's like a tax. That's why it's constitutional. That because Congress got rid of the penalty part of it, they got rid of the tax, that the rest of the law essentially now is illegal, because there's no longer a tax associated with that individual mandate. Most legal scholars on the left and the right think that that argument is not very compelling, because one of the things about American democracy, we allow Congress to change its mind, thankfully. And Congress in 2017 passed a law that said the Affordable Care Act individual mandate penalty is eliminated. We're eliminating the penalty, but we're keeping the rest of the law. So it's a bit of a difficult logic to understand why then the law would be illegal that Congress just said was okay. But that is the logic, and Judge O'Connor in Texas agreed with those 20 states. It's likely to be overturned on appeal. It's on appeal to the Fifth Circuit right now. But this is a case that potentially could make it to the Supreme Court. And if it makes it to the Supreme Court, even though all the legal experts say this is a slam dunk case, we know from experience you never know when things get to the Supreme Court. This has a major impact because of pre-existing conditions. If this was actually to go through, and today the Trump administration filed a brief with the court that they agree with the state of Texas and that the whole law should be struck down. If this were to go through, then essentially all the benefits of the Affordable Care Act would disappear, all of them. All the subsidies, all the expansions, and all the pre-existing condition protections. So keep your eye tuned to the legal part of this. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a legal scholar, I've seen a lot of episodes of Law and Order, and what I can tell you is probably more important than the legal part of this is what this case says about health politics and our political system in this country. This is political scientists' favorite diagram. It's showing you the ideology of members of Congress, of the House of Representatives. Up is conservative, down is liberal. So if you go to, say, 1945, you can see that Republicans are at a higher level than Democrats, meaning they're more conservative than Democrats. Political scientists excel at telling you obvious things in really complicated ways. But note that the distance between Republicans and Democrats wasn't that great, and between Republicans and Southern Democrats in the House, not great at all. Now look what has happened in the last couple decades in American politics. The Republican Party in Congress has become a much more conservative party. The Democratic Party has become a more liberal party. This graph doesn't show it, but there are very few Southern Democrats in the House of Representatives. So the two parties have become more homogenous. A more liberal Democratic Party, a much more conservative Republican Party. We live in a polarized time in American politics. The two parties are more polarized than at any time in American political history since the 1870s, when we were just coming out of the Civil War. So we live in an extraordinarily polarized time. You don't need a political scientist to tell you that. You can see it every day. The implication for that is hugely important for health reform. One reason the Affordable Care Act has struggled to gain legitimacy, to gain acceptance, is that it was implemented during this time of polarization. And the Affordable Care Act is just one front in a much larger partisan struggle. And one of the frustrating things about the Affordable Care Act is you can imagine a scenario where Democrats say, we love Obamacare, but it's got problems. Okay, we agree, let's make some changes. And Republicans say, we hate Obamacare, but we admit some parts of it work. Let's come together as two parties and let's make the Affordable Care Act work better and make it more affordable. That has not happened. There's no bipartisanship on this. And the reason there's no bipartisanship on this is that chasm between the two parties. The same reason we have all the dysfunction that we have right now in Washington, that we can't pass budgets, debt ceiling, all that. Healthcare is part of that polarization of American politics. I want to turn lastly to the issue of healthcare spending, and you can't talk about American healthcare without noting that we spend a lot of money on medical care, over $10,000 on average per person every year. If healthcare spending was an Olympic sport, we would win the gold every single year, and really nobody is close to us. Our neighbors to the north, who play lots of hockey, walk around on the ice and eat lots of poutine, Canada, that is, they spend, and they have a very similar standard in medical care to the United States, They spend about half of what we do per person per year. So we are a very, very expensive healthcare system. Now, I do want to note that I have some good news, and I'm noting it because I so rarely have good news. But this chart is good news. We actually have had a substantial slowdown of the rate of growth of healthcare spending. You can see in the 1970s, when I grew up in a rate of high inflation and gas lines and all that, we had, healthcare spending was going up like crazy each year, on average, over 12% a year. And you can see in the 80s, very expensive and so forth. Look what happened starting around 2009. Look what happened at those blue lines. Healthcare spending is still growing in the United States, but the rate of growth is actually very moderate and much lower than was projected. Medicare spending today is $1,000 less per person than what we projected a decade ago. $1,000 less per person. So we have had a tremendous, actually, slowdown in healthcare spending. But I bet if I went on the streets of Greensboro tomorrow morning and I asked people about this, people would say, of course, healthcare spending is going up. And they're right. It's still going up, just at a more modest clip. But they're also right because Americans aren't really experiencing the slowdown. And that's because the form of insurance, particularly private insurance, has changed. The standard for health insurance in this country in 2019 is not what it was a decade ago or 2 decades ago. This chart, pay attention to the dark line on the top, the blue line, is showing you the average deductible for people who have employer-sponsored health insurance. If I was last in Greensboro, I think in 2008, right, giving a talk, the average deductible when I was here in 2008 was $735. It's now $1,600, and many Americans face deductibles that are thousands of dollars higher than that. So Americans don't feel that healthcare spending is slowing because health insurance coverage is thinning. More of it is being pushed into higher deductibles, higher co-pays, higher co-insurance. And so more of us are paying directly for the costs of care. There are other problems and other reasons why people experience high medical care. And I want to give you a second just to read this story, which just came out last month. So this is a story about a woman in Texas who's a nurse who had insurance, and she talked about, as you can see in vivid terms and painful terms, that her battling cancer was one thing, but what she didn't count on was it wasn't just the cancer she was going to have to battle with. It was her insurance companies and dealing with her hospital and her doctors and all those bills. And there actually is a literature now in health policy called financial toxicity. Just like we talk about in cancer, the toxicity of chemotherapy, we've started to talk about financial toxicity. And what we've discovered through studies is that for a lot of cancer patients, a central part of the experience of having cancer is the financial burden. And not just the burden and all the money people have to pay for medications and so forth, but just the struggle day to day, which is what she's talking about, of having to battle the system. And we may not agree as a country about what kind of healthcare reform we should have, but I'm pretty sure we could agree as a country that this isn't right. We cannot have arrangements where people are simultaneously having to fight a disease and fight for their bureaucratic life. That just doesn't make sense. Another problem that has gotten a lot of attention recently is around surprise medical bills. And again, let me give you a minute or two to read this story. So this young man had a heart attack, and I didn't have room to show this, but actually his 7-year-old daughter was in the house, and he was able to get his 7-year-old daughter to get the phone and call his neighbor to take him to the ED. And smartly, the neighbor took him to the closest emergency room, because if you're having a heart attack, time is everything. But the thing was, the hospital that he went to was not in network for his insurance. And isn't it, by the way, I can't think of a more sad commentary on the state of American healthcare that somebody, as they're having a heart attack, felt it necessary to ask how their insurance. And I have been there. I have been in the emergency room, and I have been exactly where he was and asked that question myself. And it is troubling that we feel the need to do that. In any case, you can see the hospital was out of network, and you would think in an emergency circumstance they would say, okay, we got this covered, but what frequently happens is the hospitals and the insurers don't agree on the payment, and so they stuck them with a bill for over $100,000, a teacher, over $100,000. Unbelievable, and this phenomenon of surprise medical bills is one that's happening around the country. Many times Americans will go into hospitals that are in network, and unbeknownst to them, one member of the surgical team, it might be the anesthesiologist, will be an independent contractor and will be out of network, and they will get hit with a bill of tens of thousands of dollars that they had no way of knowing about. This, again, is evidence about the dysfunction in American healthcare, the injustice, and the problem that so many people run into in expenses. In his case, it has a happy ending. After this made the national news, the hospital decided maybe it wasn't the best publicity to charge a teacher with a heart attack $100,000 for out-of-network coverage, and so they cut his bill to $300. So that one had a happy ending. Because of all these problems that I have described and more, there is a great yearning to do something about healthcare in the United States, and it helps to explain the ascendance of Medicare for all, which, as I said, is an old idea, and it has come back, and it has come back in force. And the appeal of Medicare for all is partly its simplicity, partly its equity, and partly that it's an antidote to all the pathologies that we just discussed. That we shouldn't have a country where people were charged $100,000 for showing up at the emergency room for a heart attack. That we shouldn't have a health insurance system that punishes people with cancer. Medicare for all has growing support. A lot of Democrats running for president support it. A lot of people in Congress support it. And it has strong support in the public. And so there's no question that it's part of the debate in a way that it really hasn't been since the 1970s. However, the road to Medicare for all is very difficult. And the public support for it is strong. When you look at it, and you ask people, would you favor having Medicare for all? You'll get in different polls, different numbers, but you'll get a majority of people. But it has a lot of political vulnerabilities. And if you look at the bottom here, and you see what happens to its support if people are told, well, this is going to lead to delays, to rationing, if it's going to hurt the current Medicare program, and so forth. The political obstacles to Medicare for all today are what they have been for many decades, which is much of the healthcare industry opposes it. It's very difficult to take the patchwork health insurance system that we have, where 160 million people still have employer-sponsored coverage, and we've got Medicaid and Medicare, and to cohere them into one plan. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. But it's going to be part of the debate in 2020, and my guess is that the Democratic nominee for president in 2020 will be in favor either of Medicare for all or expanding Medicare, what I would call Medicare for more. So allowing people age 50 and older to buy into Medicare, or allowing the uninsured to buy into Medicare, something like that. Donald Trump in 2020 is likely to advocate for a repeal and replace plan that is even more ambitious than the one that Republicans ran in 2017. And again, I think the fact that Democrats have gone to Medicare for all is a testament to that polarization that I showed you before. The Republican Party has gone to the right on health care, the Democratic Party has gone to the left. And we are going to have a debate in 2020 where the parties are so very far apart on healthcare with radically different ideas of what the future of American healthcare is. And so a decade after we passed the Affordable Care Act, a decade after President Obama said he wanted to be the last president who had to talk about passing healthcare, we still are in a very uncertain time where I think the future is very hazy about what is going to become of the Affordable Care Act, which way we're going to go in healthcare reform in 2020 and beyond. And so I'm going to close by showing you a photo of my favorite person in the world. I don't know him, but he's up there with his mouth wide open. I can't really tell you what the future of healthcare reform looks like. What I can tell you is we've had an incredible roller coaster ride this last decade, and it's not over, not by a long shot. Thank you very much. I think we're going to move to question and answer, and Anne has a microphone somewhere, and she's going to come and find you. Okay, so right there.
Hi, I'm just curious, when you analyzed the total healthcare costs in the country, I think it was 3.3 billion.
Trillion.
Trillion. So
What's a few $100 billion between friends?
I'm just curious about how much of that constitutes the profit made by those private health insurers.
Yeah, so profit is part of it. It's not as big a part as people would think. I'll tell you where a lot of money is that, and we don't spend enough time talking about it, it's administrative costs. We spend an immense amount of money. Now, my view is if we want to spend the most money on medical care in the world, that's okay. If we're going to provide good medical care, that's okay. The problem is a lot of spending on medical care in this country is not on medical care. It's on administration because of this complex arrangement that we have. And that's actually a major difference. If you ask why do Canadians spend so much less than the United States does, one of the biggest reasons has to do with the administrative costs. And the Affordable Care Act did many things. The Affordable Care Act did many things, but it did not get control of the administrative costs.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. Its conciseness, its thoroughness, and its depth and breadth. I'm interested to know, from your point of view, on both a clean slate, let's just start from scratch, how you would prescribe a remedy, and how you would view proceeding with the reform of the patchwork we have. I realize that's two different, very broad questions, but from your point of view, having such experience and insight into it, it seems like you could say, all right, well, if it was up to me, this is what I would do, and I'm very curious what you would do from start from scratch, which of course would be a fantasy, but also starting with what we've got, forgetting the political realities for the moment, but looking at the financial complexity of disassembling all that administrative infrastructure and the hundreds of thousands of people that would be suddenly out of work from that movement.
Right, great question. And people often ask me, what would I do if I was in charge of the healthcare system? And I tell them, the last thing in the world you want is be in charge of the healthcare system. Bad idea. But to take your second question first, what would I do to improve things under the current arrangement? The very first thing I would try to do if I had my Harry Potter wand and I could wave it is I would try and make the Affordable Care Act more affordable. I would work on those subsidies for the middle class to make coverage truly affordable for them. And I think that's something we could afford to do as a country if we chose to do it. I think it would make the insurance pool better because it would bring more people into the pool. And I would think it would help a lot of Americans who are outside of the market, outside of the system right now. So that would be my number one priority. And I think it's something in theory that you could actually attract bipartisan support for if we didn't have that chasm that I described. What would I do if I was starting from scratch? Wow. I don't have, and this might come as a great disappointment, I don't have a single model that I'm in love with. I like a lot of different models, and so I think the United States could look to countries like Germany and Japan, which in some ways are closer to us in the sense that they don't have one government insurer. They have lots of different insurers. Now in Germany, they're non-for-profit, they're highly regulated, but you could look to that as a more decentralized model of universal coverage. Certainly the Canadian model and the Taiwanese model, which is similar to the Canadian model, has a lot of strengths in its simplicity and its elegance. I think I would be happy, you could probably give me 12 different countries' healthcare systems, and I would be happy to change to any of them. We've got people in the back there, I don't know where the mic.
Jonathan, you mentioned earlier that administrative costs are one of the reasons that healthcare costs are so high. Is it not also true that pharmaceutical companies play a large part in why healthcare costs are so high for Americans?
Yeah, that's a great question, thank you. Certainly pharmaceutical costs are a big issue in the United States and have gotten a lot of attention recently in some cases that are just staggering. I don't know if any of y'all use an EpiPen, but I do. And I remember last year when the cost of an EpiPen somehow went sky high. So we have got to do a better job at making medication affordable, and there are too many Americans who depend on medication that just can't afford to take it. And one of the findings they have in oncology, looking at financial toxicity, is physicians are prescribing medications and their patients aren't filling them because they can't afford it. I will say that this is one area, a rare area where there is some bipartisanship on this, and of course the Trump administration has had some policies and talked about ways of reducing the cost of pharmaceuticals. We'll have to see what the impact of that is, but if you want to look for an area that's hopeful of at least a potential of bipartisan action, drug pricing probably is one of those areas. Back there.
I have a question about, again, the administrative costs, and costs, two senses of cost. First, what are the administrative costs of Medicare and Medicaid as opposed to private health insurance and administering the ACA healthcare marketplace? And second, if you went to a Medicare for all, has anybody done a study of what the cost would be on the taxpayer compared to the reduction in premiums for the different financial, the 20,000 earner versus up through that?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So, one of the things about Medicare for All, because it has been marginal to the central political debate, there haven't been as many studies exhaustive in trying to break down the cost. So there are estimates of administrative savings, and certainly Medicare has much lower administrative costs than private insurance does. If you move to a Medicare for All system or something like it, in theory you should have lower administrative costs because everybody's in one pool and you don't have all the fragmentation and complexity. The big question for Medicare for All is how you pay for it. And there is no such thing as a health reform plan that will make 100% of people better off in that they're all going to be happy and all paying less. Healthcare reform is inherently disruptive, and under Medicare for All, some people would certainly pay less. Some people would probably pay more through taxes for it. And so you're asking a great question, which is, how does it compare at the income level? I don't think we have good enough studies, at least that I've seen yet, but you're asking the kind of question that we need the answers to. Absolutely.
I'm on Medicare, thank God, because I have cancer now. And I kind of understand what Medicare for All would look like. People who talk about that also talk about single payer. And could you describe what single payer means as opposed to Medicare for all?
So thank you for the question. There's a lot of confusion in the country, and it's getting even more confused. I am part of a study group that's looking at options for how to expand Medicare, not just Medicare for all, but different kinds of options, incremental options. And after listening to the study panel for a day and a half, I told them on a conference call that I no longer understand even what Medicare is. So it's a complex thing. And let me start with Medicare, because when people say Medicare for all, first thing to understand about the Medicare program is private insurers have a big role in the Medicare program today. They play a role and have from the beginning of the program as fiscal intermediaries, processing claims and so forth. So they play an administrative role. But also one out of about every 3 Medicare enrollees is in what's called a Medicare Advantage plan, which is a private insurance plan that contracts with the Medicare program. You get extra benefits if you sign up. And so even our Medicare program now is not completely government-run insurance. When people say single payer, what they really mean is Canadian-style national health insurance. In Canada, in each province, their equivalent of our state, there is one government insurance program, and that's it. So single payer, they are the single payer. Because they're not very original in Canada, their program is also called Medicare. They couldn't think of a better name, I guess, I don't know. So that's what people mean. But there's complexity. When you ask Americans, Medicare for all, a lot of Americans, what they hear is, oh, what you're saying is anybody could buy into Medicare as an option. And so the opinion polls will show you that most Americans, when they hear Medicare for all, don't think you're talking about literally every single American in Medicare. They think it means every American would have a choice to join Medicare, which is very different than saying Medicare is going to replace everything. And just to add to that complexity even more, as you all know, and I can tell that there might be 2 or 3 people on Medicare here in the room, Medicare has lots of benefit gaps and lots of holes itself. And so most of the plans that are out there in Congress or that presidential candidates are offering for Medicare for all, they're not talking about the current Medicare program. They're talking about taking the current Medicare program and improving it and adding more benefits to it. So thank you for the question, because it really is complex. And when you hear candidates talk about, and this is a good League of Women Voters kind of issue, when you hear them talk about Medicare for all, whether they're for it or against it, you have to kind of press them and ask, what do they mean by that? Because people mean very different things behind that label.
I'm kind of intrigued by the fact that we got the Affordable Care Act so closely on the heels of the Great Depression in 2008, and there are a lot of market watchers, of course, who are already beginning to ask us to be aware of potential next phase economic downturns. I'm also intrigued by the fact, after working in an academic medical center for a number of years, I became personally of the opinion that healthcare just can't be treated in the marketplace like a typical commodity. So do you have any comment on whether we should be hoping for another economic downturn in order to get another next phase of healthcare reform, or how does the market in healthcare really truly operate?
Well, I'm hoping to retire and move to Hawaii, where my wife is from, so I am not hoping for another downturn. I need to keep building up that Aloha fund. You're right that in times of economic uncertainty, the normal rules of American politics bend, and it's not an accident what we got in 2009 and 2010. So I certainly hope we do not enter anything like the Great Recession in 2008. If we were to enter a period of volatility like that, then the political prospects probably broaden for government action. The question about can we treat healthcare like a market good, you can't treat it like a pure market good, and there's no country in the world that does, none. And in fact, the United States did not treat it as a pure market good before the Affordable Care Act. We had Medicare. We had Medicaid. We have the Children's Health Insurance Program. We have lots of federal regulation and state regulation. So we ourselves have not treated it like a pure market good. The question is, can you have a healthcare system that retains market incentives in insurance? That's the question. And that's one that we have not settled as a country. We have a system or non-system that's a hybrid, that's mixed with government insurers, for-profit insurers, non-for-profit insurers. And the question is, can you get something functional out of that? Can you make that work? And that's what the Affordable Care Act really was trying to do. There are people who, of course, want it to be more of a pure market, and there are ways to do that. And there are people who want to have no market in healthcare, and there are ways to do that. I guess the bottom line is you have to settle your values to settle your health insurance arrangements. And in most other rich democracies, those values have already been settled, and it allows them to have a consensus on what their health insurance arrangements look like. We have not settled our first principles in healthcare yet.